Israel was fracturing from within. Facing the looming shadow of Philistine armies, a desperate people chose to turn their backs on the divine. In response, God gave them Saul, a king, driven by jealousy and pride. Soon his violent paranoia tore the nation apart. The nation bled because they chose a human ruler over sacred trust. But heaven had not forgotten them. In the silent hills of Bethlehem, a response was growing. Out of those lonely pastures walked a boy destined to reshape history. David. His name itself whispered of a deeper connection to the sacred. We know him as the shepherd who faced giants with a simple sling. We remember the king who ruled with justice and sang songs of absolute surrender. But this is also about the fragile human beneath the crown, his heavy doubts, his massive failures, and his private prayers. David was deeply human. His fiercest struggles were not fought on battlefields, but in the dark corners of isolation and desire. He carried the suffocating weight of leadership. Before that, he lived in obscurity, tending his father's flock in the quiet hills of Bethlehem. He did it not out of passion, but because his father saw him as fit for nothing else. Nobody expected him to amount to anything. A quiet, unremarkable life would do. While Jesse provided basic care, it paled in comparison to the fierce love David received from his mother. His mother was different. Though Scripture never names her leaving her life in the shadows, her presence was undeniable. She left an indelible mark on his soul, teaching him how to worship with sincerity. She taught him that God searches the deepest parts of man. She alone believed in his inner strength. When the rest of the family cast him aside, David carried her quiet faith like a burning torch. Her tender care molded his character. The truths she whispered to him as a boy echoed constantly in the silence of the pastures. Assigned the dirtiest chores, he never grew bitter. He worked with quiet pride, holding fast to the seeds his mother had planted. Being the youngest, David watched his brothers chase glory, while his own dreams waited. He was a soldier training in a pasture far from any battlefield. While his brothers marched to war, David watched the flock. While distant swords clashed, he stood in the silence with a leather sling. As armies gathered on the front lines, David fought off lions and bears to protect his lambs. Yet he never complained, never demanded applause. A sling at his waist, a harp on his back. He was small and simply dressed, but possessed a rare fire. He honored his mother's faith in total anonymity. Years later, he would pray, "Truly I am your servant, Lord, just as my mother was. You have broken my chains. Amen." In the deep stillness of the fields, he would whisper, "Lord, do you see me? Is this enough? Just a sling and some songs." A quiet peace would wash over him like a divine whisper of reassurance. He was chosen for an incredible destiny, completely unaware of what lay ahead. He did not realize his daily trials were a quiet training ground. God was preparing him not just to fight, but to rule. His praises echoed through the hills. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He restores my soul and guides my steps along paths of righteousness. Though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are beside me." His family ignored him, but heaven watched closely. God saw more than a future giant slayer. He saw the loyal shepherd who guarded the flock when nobody was looking. He held on to hope when his world offered no room for dreams. Soon this boy would face Goliath, unite a kingdom, and become a man after God's own heart. He had no idea that a routine errand would soon lead him to a valley where giants fall and kings are born. Meanwhile, the prophet Samuel grieved. He had anointed Saul under divine command, but Saul's rebellion meant his tragic reign was drawing to a close. Then the divine voice broke through. "How long will you grieve for Saul? I have rejected him. Fill your flask with oil and go to Bethlehem. Look for a man named Jesse, for I have chosen one of his sons to rule." But Samuel trembled, knowing that if Saul found out, it would mean his death. God replied, "Take a heifer with you, and say you have come to offer a sacrifice. Invite Jesse and his sons, and I will show you the one you must anoint." Samuel did as he was told. When his shadow fell upon Bethlehem, the town elders trembled with fear. "Why has the prophet come?" they whispered in the streets. The elders approached him trembling and asked if he came in peace. "I come in peace," he replied. After consecrating Jesse and his sons, he welcomed them to the feast. The moment they arrived, Samuel's eyes fell upon the oldest brother, Eliab. "Surely this is God's chosen," the prophet thought. Eliab stood tall, imposing and confident. But God warned him, "Do not judge by his physical stature or handsome face. I have rejected him." While humans look at the outward appearance, the Lord looks straight into the heart. 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, and each time heaven stayed silent. Confused, Samuel asked, "Are these all your boys?" Jesse hesitated. There was one left, the son he had not even bothered to invite. "There is still the youngest," Jesse muttered defensively. "He is tending the sheep out in the wild." "Send for him," Samuel ordered. "We will not begin our feast until he stands before us." David had been called for chores before, but this felt different. The messengers told him to wash up quickly. David wondered why his father suddenly cared how he looked in front of company. Shaking off his confusion, he bypassed the formal greeting and walked straight in. He arrived smelling of sweat and sheep covered in dust. Yet as he stood there, a divine whisper filled Samuel's mind. "This is the one." Samuel stared at the scruffy boy, so unlike his grandbrothers. But when their eyes locked, the prophet saw a fierce, brilliant spark burning deep within his soul. David stood frozen in quiet awe, his voice completely failing him. He looked at Samuel, then met his brother's bewildered stares. What mystery was unfolding in this room, he wondered. Then, without a moment of hesitation, Samuel raised the flask, pouring the sacred anointing oil over David's head. A rich fragrance filled the air, and suddenly the divine spirit rushed over the young shepherd. David wiped the oil from his eyes, deeply shaken by an internal awakening he could not yet fully comprehend. He was awake. A soft inner voice whispered that he was truly seen and chosen. He turned to look at his father and brothers. Complete silence hung in the room. For the first time, David felt a profound shift within. From that day forward, David knew his old life was gone. 1 Samuel 16:13. Eliab clenched his jaw. This oil belonged to a warrior, not a simple shepherd. Jesse stood frozen, looking from the prophet to his youngest boy. He never expected this day, nor such immense honor for his household, and certainly not for David. Yet Jesse remained silent, watching the oil stream down the face of the son he had overlooked. He could not foresee that this boy would one day compose songs to echo through generations, conquer terrifying giants, and establish dynasties of kings. Yet David still smelled of sheep. He held no sword, but the hands that tended vulnerable lambs would soon defeat a giant. The neglected heart would one day govern an entire nation. On his journey to Ramah, Samuel's mind overflowed with thoughts of the young boy. David was the forgotten son left out of the sacrifice, yet chosen by the divine. While humanity remained blind to this choice, Samuel knew this boy would reshape the course of human history. Meanwhile, darkness descended upon Saul's palace. The divine presence had abandoned the king, replaced by a tormenting spirit that plunged his mind into deep terror and heavy despair. His mind fractured between violent rage and crippling sorrow. Watching in fear, his servants suggested finding a skilled musician to play the harp. They believed the music would soothe his troubled soul. A servant then mentioned that one of Jesse's sons in Bethlehem was exceptionally gifted with the harp. He is also a brave soldier, wise in speech and resilient in battle. Beyond his handsome appearance, it is clear the Lord walks with him. So Saul dispatched messengers to Jesse with a direct command to send his shepherd son David. Jesse received the royal summons with shaking hands. A father's instinct made Jesse want to hide David, shielding him from the crushing weight of his calling and the path of destiny. But since the hour Samuel anointed the boy, Jesse knew the divine decree was set. After all, who could possibly resist the will of the Almighty? He claimed he was protecting his youngest, but deep down, he was terrified. Terrified of the dangerous burden that comes with divine favor. He feared the ultimate cost of David's calling. Now, with the king's summons, Jesse's silence was broken. He had to decide whether to step aside or oppose God's plan. He quickly called David, sending him to Saul with a young goat, a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine. Unlike his father, David did not hesitate. He was adapting to these abrupt disruptions that tore him from the quiet fields and threw him into the unknown. Ever since his anointing, a deep courage had begun to take root. Guided by a strength far greater than his own, he set out. Not long after, David stood inside the grand palace chambers, harp in hand, ready to serve. As his fingers swept the strings, the music breathed the quiet peace of open meadows and still waters. Long before the words were penned, his soul sang of trust. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the fortress of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advance to destroy me, it is my enemies and foes who will stumble and fall. Psalm 27, verses 1 and 2. As the sweet melody drifted, the shadow over Saul lifted, his breathing eased, and the heavy atmosphere finally cleared. "What is your name, boy?" the king asked, his voice softened by wonder. "I am David, son of Jesse," the boy replied, looking straight into the king's eyes. He saw eyes filled with deep exhaustion, haunted by an internal brokenness. He did not see an adversary, but a leader who once walked in light and now stood in shadow. Looking at Saul, David silently hoped the divine presence would return to comfort the tortured king. Saul sensed something unique about this youth, far exceeding the reports he received. He expected a mere musician, not this profound, calming presence. The boy's composure was not youthful pride, but something far weightier. It felt as if David carried not just a harp, but the very breath of heaven. Saul could not explain it, but he felt a quiet authority in this shepherd boy. Over time, the king grew deeply fond of David. He appointed him as his armor-bearer, bringing him into his close trust. Whenever the dark torment returned, David played restoring peace to the troubled ruler. 1 Samuel 16:21-23. In the quiet of those royal chambers, the shepherd's harp became far more than simple music. It transformed into a channel of mercy and a gateway to the sacred. Through David's song, a whisper of hope reached a fracturing throne. Even without a crown upon his brow, the divine hand was already positioning him at the very center of the kingdom. On the war front, the Philistines mobilized their armies for battle. King Saul responded by gathering his troops near the valley of Ah. The opposing armies stood on facing hills, divided only by the valley below. High tension paralyzed the Israelite camp, with every soldier waiting for a move no one dared make. Suddenly, a massive figure stepped out from the Philistine ranks. Goliath, a champion of Gath, standing over 9 feet tall. His bronze armor gleamed in the sun. With every step, the earth shook, and his voice boomed across the valley like thunder. His armor-bearer marched ahead, carrying a massive shield. Goliath halted, shouting his challenge across the divide. "Why do you come to fight? I am the Philistine champion, while you are merely Saul's servants. Choose a man to face me. If he wins, we serve you. But if I defeat him, you become our slaves." I defy Israel's armies. Today send me a challenger." Hearing this, Saul and his soldiers were gripped with terror. Why do we freeze when our deepest fears call us out? The giant wanted only one man. Yet for 40 days, morning and night, the challenge echoed. And for 40 days, everyone trembled, even the king. In Bethlehem, Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were serving with Saul. Jesse, aged and slowing down, relied on young David to keep the homestead running. David split his time between watching the flock and running errands. Then one day, Jesse called him. "Take this roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers. Deliver these 10 cheeses to their commander. See how they fare, and bring back word of their safety." David left his flock with a keeper and departed at dawn. By the time he reached the camp, the army was stirring. The soldiers of Israel were rushing toward the battle lines with loud cries. Then, just like before, Goliath stepped out from the Philistine ranks, hurling his usual mockery and defiance. The moment the Israelites saw him, they retreated in terror. A desperate whisper rippled through the ranks. "Have you seen him? He comes out daily to mock us." Hearing this, a righteous anger flared inside David. He asked, "What is the reward for the man who kills this giant? Who is this godless foreigner to defy the armies of the living God?" A soldier muttered back, "The king has promised a massive fortune to anyone who stops him. He will give him his daughter in marriage and free his family from taxes forever." But David's oldest brother Eliab overheard him talking. He confronted David, his voice burning with anger. "What are you doing here anyway? Who is watching your tiny flock in the wilderness? I know your arrogant, wicked heart. You just wanted to watch the slaughter." David knew this sting of rejection well. Ever since Samuel anointed him, his brothers had treated him with bitter jealousy. "What did I do now?" David shot back. "I was only asking a simple question." But word of the boy's fearless chatter spread quickly. It reached King Saul, who summoned him at once. Inside the royal tent, Saul shook his head. "You cannot fight this giant. You are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." David stood his ground. "I have kept my father's sheep. When a lion or bear stole a lamb, I chased it down, struck it, and snatched the prey. If it turned on me, I grabbed it by its throat and killed it. I have slain both the lion and the bear. This godless Philistine will be no different. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the beast will rescue me from this giant." Seeing the fire in David's eyes, Saul relented. "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul offered his own heavy bronze armor, but David could barely move in it. He took it off, realizing that if he was going to win this battle, he must fight exactly how God had trained him with his father's sheep, without armor, without a sword. That night they gave him a tent to rest and prepare for the battle ahead. As the quiet camp slept, David remembered those cold nights, guarding the flock, always watchful, always alert. Deep in the darkness, a song of worship began to rise within his spirit. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my strength in whom I trust." Psalm 18, verses 1 and 2. The ancient words anchored his soul. It was in these dark hours that the beasts had always attacked, finding David ready, just as Goliath would find him tomorrow. Guided by this spirit of worship, David walked down to a nearby brook. He knelt and selected 5 smooth stones, relying not on physical power, but on divine wisdom. As his fingers closed around the first stone, a memory stirred. The God who delivered him then would deliver him now. That first stone was faith. The second was obedience. He had not looked for this war, but God had selected him. The third stone burned with courage, the fire to charge forward when everyone else fled. The fourth was preparation every silent battle with wild beasts had prepared him for this hour. The fifth stone was victory, a promise that the battle belongs to God alone. David stood armed not just with river stones, but with an unshakable song. Sling in hand, David stepped out to face his giant. The massive Philistine champion advanced. At first, Goliath assumed the Israelites had sent a mere messenger. Behind his heavy shield-bearer, he watched the young boy approach, waiting for him to speak. But David remained silent. No terms, no surrender. Suddenly, the giant realized the shocking truth this boy was here to fight. He roared with laughter. A boy, young, small, and completely unarmed. The sheer audacity of it. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? Come closer, he hissed, and I will feed your flesh to the wild birds and beasts. The giant's booming laughter echoed across the valley, and the Philistine army cheered. But across the ravine, the Israelites shrank back in fear. Their hope vanished. Yet David stood like stone. He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear. He remembered how God had delivered him through it all. Now only one burning focus remained. This giant had to fall. He raised his voice clear, calm, and steady. You come against me with sword, spear, and shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, God of Israel's armies, whom you have insulted. Today the Lord will conquer you through me, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 to 47. The entire valley fell silent. Even the mocking Philistines fell quiet, suddenly uneasy. Goliath drew himself up to his full, towering height, pure rage burning in his eyes. How could someone so small, unarmed, and unprotected dare mock him? He raised his massive spear, ready to crush the boy. But then David ran. He didn't wait for the giant to make the first move. Charging forward, he ran directly toward Goliath, kicking up dust as his feet pounded the earth. The Israelites gasped. Some wept while others watched in paralyzed shock. Reaching into his bag, David drew a stone and loaded his sling. He whirled the leather strap overhead faster and faster, then let fly. The stone whistled through the air, sinking deep into Goliath's forehead. His eyes went blank. The giant's smug grin vanished. He tottered, trying desperately to find his footing, but it was over. He knew the shepherd's God had conquered him. With a crash, Goliath collapsed face first. His armor clanged like thunderproof that the giants we fear most are destined to fall into dust. What happens inside us when the giants we fear suddenly fall? In the heavy silence, no one moved. Then panic erupted. Their champion was gone. Stunned, the Israelites roared in triumph. But the boy warrior wasn't finished. He ran toward the fallen giant, pulled Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and ended the war with one blow. Terror gripped the Philistines. They scattered, fleeing in every direction. Weapons clattered to the earth in their retreat. The Israelites, once paralyzed by fear, now charged forward with a roaring shout, chasing them across the valley. David stood victorious, hoisting the giant's head high. This was no illusion. The God who had anointed him in secret had now vindicated him in public. And from the young man's lips came a song. The Lord delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me. By my God, I can run through a troop. By my God, I have leaped over a wall. It is God who arms me with strength and clears my path. Psalm 18, verses 17, 29, and 32. From his vantage point, King Saul watched the entire clash. He stared at the youth who once played the harp to soothe him, now standing as a conquering warrior before all Israel. Pride filled his mind, but a cold unease crept in. He turned to Abner, his army's commander. "Abner," Saul asked, "whose son is this youth?" Abner shook his head. "As surely as your soul lives, O king, I do not know." "Find out," Saul commanded, his eyes locked on David. When David returned from the slaughter, Abner ushered him before the king. The boy still carried the head of the giant in his hand, though he had left the giant's armor in his tent. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul inquired. David, remaining calm, answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." This moment should have united them in lasting peace, but soon it would warp into bitter hatred. Yet David had no intention of keeping Goliath's head nearby. Instead, he carried it straight to Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem was still controlled by the Jebusites. Yet David left the skull there, not as a mere trophy, but as something far deeper. It was a silent prophecy. The very soil where he buried the giant's head would become his fortress. The city of David, the sacred home where the Ark of God would finally rest. And looking far beyond David's time, another descendant would one day ride into that very same city, not to carry a warrior's trophy, but to crush the ancient serpent's head forever. What David started, Christ would complete. Leaving the court, David crossed paths with Jonathan, the king's son. As their eyes met, an instant bond formed between them. Jonathan recognized more than raw courage in this youth. He saw the unmistakable hand of God. Right then, loving him as his own soul, Jonathan made a sacred covenant with David. He sealed it by stripping off his royal robe, giving David his armor, sword, bow, and belt. Their souls were knit together in deep loyalty, bound by an oath to stand side by side through whatever lay ahead. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1-4. For David, this was his first taste of true brotherhood. He felt the pure love Jonathan held for him, recognizing it as a gift from God. Soon after, when the army marched home victorious, women from every village poured into the streets, dancing and playing instruments as they celebrated. Their song echoed wide, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." But King Saul found no joy in their song. With every refrain, his pride turned to poison. His smile hardened into a bitter, jealous glare. "They give David credit for 10,000s and me only thousands," he whispered. "Next, they will offer him the crown." From that hour, Saul watched David with dark suspicion. Yet Jonathan, the king's heir, saw no rival in David. He saw only a courageous, faithful brother who would never betray his trust. Saul, however, was scheming. He watched as David prospered in every task and decided to weaponize that very success against him. He promoted the young man to command the army secretly, hoping the violence of war would take his life. From that moment, Saul kept David close, refusing to let him return home to Bethlehem. But the scheme backfired. Wherever David was sent, God granted him victory, and the people of Israel and Judah loved him more with each passing day, as he led them with wisdom and courage. Meanwhile, Saul grew increasingly unstable. When a dark, tormenting spirit overcame him, he raved like a madman inside his palace. David was brought in to play the harp just as before, but while the music tried to soothe his mind, Saul's hand quietly reached for a spear. Suddenly, Saul lunged and hurled the weapon, intending to pin David to the wall. David slipped away, escaping twice as Saul tried and failed again. Terror gripped Saul. He realized the Lord was with David and had abandoned him. Yet he refused to stop. He removed David from his presence, placing him over 1,000 troops, hoping the weight of command would lead to his doom. Instead, every battle brought triumph, and with every victory, Saul's dread grew deeper. As David's fame climbed across the land, his devotion to the Lord remained unshaken. Saul's silent fury only grew. His plotting did not stop. Since blades and wars had failed, Saul tried a new trap, marriage. He offered his eldest daughter Merab to David. "Only serve me bravely and fight the Lord's battles," Saul urged. Yet David's heart was never motivated by earthly titles or rewards. He understood that the battle belonged solely to the Creator. The purpose God planted inside him was already unfolding. The unseen shepherd boy who once tended a few sheep in obscurity was now leading the armies of Israel. The quiet faith that kept him safe in the wild was now defending a nation against empires. When the wedding day arrived, Saul broke his promise, marrying Merab to someone else. But a new opportunity soon presented itself. His younger daughter Michal was in love with David. Saul was pleased not out of fatherly joy, but because he saw a fresh snare. Saul told David, "You have a second opportunity to join my royal house." Then he instructed his courtiers to whisper, "The king favors you, and so do we. Why not accept the king's offer and become his son-in-law?" When they approached David with these words, he responded, "How can a poor youth from an ordinary family pay the bride price for a princess?" When this was carried back to Saul, he devised a deadly cost. "Tell David the bride price is simple 100 Philistine foreskins. Vengeance on my enemies is all I truly desire." Quietly, Saul smiled. Sure, the Philistines would destroy the boy, but David welcomed the deadly challenge with open arms. Before time ran out, David and his men went out and slaughtered not 100, but 200 Philistines, presenting their grim toll to the king. Saul surrendered his daughter Michal to David as his wife. Yet seeing God's hand on the young warrior and his own daughter's deep love for him, cold terror gripped the king. The same youth who once eased his tormented soul with a harp now stood as proof that God had abandoned him. Saul's dread only deepened. From that day on, the king remained David's bitter enemy for life. Yet the young shepherd's ascent could not be stopped. With every Philistine assault, David brought Israel triumph, outshining every general in Saul's army. Soon his name was a whisper of hope across the entire nation. From bloodied battlefields to quiet villages, his glory echoed. Saul could no longer mask the growing rot in his own soul. The king ordered his guards and his own son Jonathan to murder David. But Jonathan loved David like a brother and went immediately to warn his friend. "By morning you must hide in the fields. I will bring my father out there and speak with him about you. Whatever I learn, I will come back and tell you." 1 Samuel 19, verses 2 and 3. At sunrise, Jonathan bravely confronted his father. He spoke with courage, reminding Saul of David's loyalty. "Do not sin against your servant," Jonathan pleaded. "He has done nothing but serve you faithfully. He risked his very life to slay the giant, and God delivered a massive triumph to Israel. You rejoiced back then, so why spill the blood of an innocent man now? There is simply no reason for it." For a brief moment, Saul's armor cracked. He listened to his son and swore a sacred oath. "By the living God, David shall not be killed." Jonathan ran back to his friend with the news, bringing him back into the royal court. For a time, peace seemed real again. Yet quiet never lingered in a mind so broken. When war erupted once more, David led his armies against the Philistines. His triumphs were absolute, scattering his enemies. But with every victory, Saul's jealousy grew colder. He sat alone in the shadows of his throne room. The crown on his brow felt crushing, weighed down not by gold, but by a paralyzing dread. Outside, the streets echoed with praise for David's triumph. The ecstatic cheers outside pierced the heavy palace walls. Saul's eyes darted to the doors, restless, consumed by suspicion. "Who is this boy?" he muttered, his voice trembling with rage. "A mere shepherd, slaying giants adored by everyone. Is my kingdom slipping away?" He paced the floor, his hands shaking as his mind fractured. "Everyone is plotting. Everyone wants my crown, even David. The prophecy says he will rule. Replaced by a boy. I cannot let this happen. He summoned his inner circle, his voice sharp with paranoia. Watch his every move. Watch the whole nation. If there is a whisper of treason, I will hear it. As the guards watched him sink back into his throne, they saw a man utterly swallowed by fear. Every laugh from the streets, every shout of joy for David felt like a blade sliding into his chest. His mind spiraled, choked by paranoia that grew heavier by the hour. One night, while David played his harp to soothe him, Saul sat in the darkness, clutching a spear. Suddenly, the dark tormenting spirit seized him once more. In a flash of blind rage, Saul hurled the spear straight at the young musician. The weapon hissed past his head, burying itself in the stone wall. David narrowly escaped, fleeing into the cold night while the iron point vibrated in the rock. That night, Saul's rage burned hotter than ever. He dispatched a hit squad to surround David's home with one clear order: kill him at sunrise. But David's wife Michal discovered the plot. Escape tonight, she warned, or tomorrow you die. David stood frozen as absolute shock washed over him. Could it be the king he had served, played music for, and honored as father, now hunting him like a beast? What had he done wrong? His mind raced, but time had run out. Michal pushed him toward the window. With a heavy chest, David lowered himself into the dark. As his feet touched the cold earth, one thought consumed him. There was no time to think he had to escape. David vanished into the night, just as the guards closed in. Desperate to buy him time, Michal grabbed a household idol, put it in the bed, and pulled up the blankets. She placed goat hair at the head of the mattress, arranging it to mimic her sleeping husband. When the guards burst through the door, Michal claimed he was too ill to move. They reported back to the king, but Saul, white with rage, issued a chilling order. Bring him to me on his mattress, Saul spat, so I can kill him myself. The soldiers returned only to uncover the trick. Stripping the sheets, they found nothing but an idol and animal hair. Saul turned his fury onto his daughter, screaming, "Why have you betrayed me and helped my enemy escape?" Terrified, Michal trembled. Though her heart belonged to David, she looked her father in the eye and said, "He threatened to kill me if I didn't help him escape." Meanwhile, David fled to Ramah, seeking sanctuary with the prophet Samuel. At Naioth, he spilled his wounded soul, and Samuel took him in among the holy prophets. Word reached the king David was in Naioth. Saul sent troops to seize him, but they arrived to find Samuel presiding over a choir of prophets in ecstatic worship. Suddenly, the Spirit of God swept over the assassins. Instead of capturing David, they fell into holy ecstasy. Unbelieving Saul sent a second wave. The same thing happened. A third group was sent, and they too were overcome by the Spirit. Blind with rage, Saul decided to go himself. "Where are Samuel and David?" he demanded. Local onlookers pointed the way to Naioth. But before the king could even lay eyes on his rival, the Spirit of God seized him too. He began to prophesy on the road, eventually stripping off his royal robes and collapsing to the earth, lying naked in Samuel's presence all day and night. Stunned onlookers asked in utter disbelief, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" This was the ultimate inescapable sign. God was with David, and no king could stand against him. Why does fear drive us to hunt down those we once loved? David learned Saul had reached Ramah, left wondering what sin had marked him for death. Terrified, he sought out Jonathan. His voice broke as he whispered, "What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he thirsts for my blood?" But Jonathan, blind to the darkness, shook his head. "No, you will not die. My father shares everything with me. He wouldn't keep this from me." But David pressed harder. "Your father knows of our bond. He spares you the pain, but I swear to you death is breathing down my neck." Seeing the terror in his eyes, Jonathan softened. "Tell me how I can help." And David laid out his plan. Tomorrow is the new moon feast, and my seat at the king's table will stand empty. If your father remains calm, I am safe. But if his rage flares, you will know his mind is set on my destruction. Jonathan made a sacred vow. If my father intends to harm you, may God strike me down if I do not warn you. Go, and may the Lord be with you as he once was with my father. They bound their souls in a final covenant sealed with tears. The feast began. Saul took his place, but David's seat remained ominously empty. On the first day, Saul stayed silent. But when the second day passed, his voice cut through the hall. Why is the son of Jesse absent? Jonathan answered with care. David begged to leave for Bethlehem for a family sacrifice. Saul's face twisted in blind rage. He roared, "You foolish rebel! Do you not see? While David draws breath, your kingdom is nothing. Fetch him. He must die." Jonathan stood up, his blood boiling with anger. Why should he die? What is his crime? In response, Saul hurled a spear at his own flesh and blood. The bitter truth was finally laid bare. At dawn, Jonathan went to the field. He shot an arrow far beyond his servant boy, crying out, "The arrow is further ahead! Run faster!" David knew the warning. Once the boy had gone, he stepped from the shadows. He bowed low, then held Jonathan close, their shared grief washing over them. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "Go in peace. We have sworn a holy oath. Let the Lord stand between us and our children, a witness to our bond forever." With broken hearts, but an unbroken covenant, they went their separate ways. Separated yet bound by a sacred promise, David fled deeper into exile. He arrived in Nob seeking shelter from Ahimelech the priest. But the priest trembled when he saw him. "Why are you alone? Where is your guard?" David had no easy answers to give, so he spoke quickly, weaving a desperate lie. "The king ordered me on a secret mission. My men are waiting nearby. What food do you have? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or anything at all." Ahimelech shook his head. "I have no common bread, only the sacred showbread." "Have your men kept themselves pure?" David offered immediate reassurance. "Fear not. My men are always clean, even on common journeys. How much more so today?" So the priest handed him the consecrated holy bread, bread that had just been replaced that very morning. But another pair of eyes watched from the shadows. Doeg, the Edomite Saul's chief herdsman, saw everything. David saw Doeg and felt the trap closing. He turned to the priest. "Do you have a sword or spear?" "The king's mission was so urgent I left unarmed." Ahimelech hesitated, then whispered, "The only weapon here is the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the sacred vest. Take it if you wish." David's eyes gleamed with recognition. "There is none like it. Give it to me." Gripping the giant's blade, David fled once more. He crossed the border into enemy territory, seeking asylum in Gath with King Achish. But the king's men whispered in suspicion, "Is this not David their champion? The one they praise in song, saying, 'Saul killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands'?" Fear gripped David's heart. Trapped in the lion's den, he resorted to a desperate act of deception. He began clawing madly at the city gates. He let saliva drool down his beard. The great champion of Israel, the giant slayer, feigned madness just to survive. Escaping Gath, he sought refuge in the deep cave of Adullam. Soon his family tracked him down. They could have betrayed him to Saul to save their own lives. Instead, they chose to share his exile in that cold, damp cavern. A profound sense of relief washed over David. In the darkness, he realized God had not abandoned him or his house. Amid his suffering, the heavens were answering the silent prayers of his youth. A prayer rose from the depths of his soul. "The Lord is my strength and shield. My heart trusts him, and I am helped. My soul rejoices. The Lord is the strength of his people, a fortress of salvation for his anointed king. Save your people and bless your heritage. Be their shepherd and carry them forever. Soon others gathered in the dark, the broken, the heavily indebted, the bitter and the desperate. They looked to David for leadership and hope. Before long, he was captain over 400 men, not a trained army, but an empire of outlaws. He knew his path would never be easy, but he never imagined that the crown would cost him his safety, turning him into a marked man. From a simple shepherd boy to a hunted fugitive, his journey was forged in fire. Yet the Spirit of God that anointed him shielded him at every turn. Though his brothers stayed, David feared for his aging parents. Seeking their safety, he approached the king of Moab, bowing low before him. Please let my mother and father find refuge here, until I see what God will do for me. The king agreed, and David returned to his cave. The dark walls of Adullam became a crucible. Surrounded by danger, he learned to shepherd these broken men, just as he once did his flock. This exile was a necessary season of preparation. One morning the silence was broken when the prophet Gad arrived with a word from God. "Do not stay in this stronghold," Gad warned. "Return to Judah." David had long waited for this call. Gathering his men, he prepared them for the next step. "We head for the forest of Hereth," he commanded. "Trust the Lord." Where Saul saw only threat, David saw a threshold of faith. While dread and paranoia consumed Saul's palace, David remained calm. He knew true destiny is received by promise, not seized by raw force. The prophecy that terrified Saul was a beacon of hope to David, proving that divine timing shapes the future. As Saul's fear hardened into wrath, David waited with quiet conviction. His journey showed that real strength rises from trust, not panic. Soon word of his return reached the desperate king. Saul sat beneath the tamarisk tree on the heights of Gibeah, spear in hand, surrounded by his men. Fury consumed him. "Men of Benjamin," the king cried, "will the son of Jesse give you fields and vineyards? Has he promised you high rank? Even my own son conspires against me." Then Doeg the Edomite stepped forward. "I saw David at Nob," he said. "He spoke with Ahimelech the priest, who gave him bread, the sword of Goliath, and sought counsel from heaven for him." Saul's face darkened with rage. "Summon Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob." The priest entered, trembling. "Why have you plotted against me with David?" the king roared. "Why give him food and weapons? Why seek God for him? You urge him to strike me down." Ahimelech answered, his voice trembling. "David is your most loyal servant. He is your son-in-law, leader of your guard, and honored in your home. I knew nothing of a conspiracy." "You shall die," Saul screamed. "You and your entire house." The guards froze, refusing to strike the priests of the Lord. Saul turned to his servant. "Doeg, do it." Doeg obeyed, slaughtering 85 priests that day, all wearing their holy garments. He then destroyed the town of Nob, slaying men, women, children, and livestock. Later, Abiathar escaped, stumbling into David's camp breathless. "Saul has slaughtered the Lord's priests," he cried. "My entire household is gone." David bowed his head, crushed by grief. "I knew it. When I saw Doeg there, I knew he would tell Saul. This tragedy lies on me." He grasped Abiathar's hand. "Stay with me, do not fear. The one who hunts my life hunts yours as well. By my side you will find safety." Soon news reached David that the Philistines were raiding Keilah, plundering grain from the threshing floors. Seeking a path, David turned to the divine. "Should I go and fight them?" the Lord answered. "Go defend Keilah." But David's men hesitated. They were already living in fear within Judah, and fighting a Philistine army felt like madness. David prayed once more, and God assured him, "Go down, for I will give you victory." With that promise, David led his men to Keilah. They defeated the invaders, reclaimed the stolen livestock, and saved the town. But word traveled fast. Learning David was inside a gated city, Saul believed his enemy was finally trapped. He mobilized his forces. David, sensing the trap, turned to prayer once more. "Will Saul march against me here?" he asked. The Lord replied, "He will." Then David asked, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him?" Again, the Lord answered, "They will." So David and his 600 men fled Keilah before Saul could strike. From then on, David retreated into the harsh wilderness and the barren hills of Ziph. Saul pursued him every single day. But God kept David hidden. In the shadows, Jonathan found David and revived his spirit, reminding him of the divine promise, "You shall be king. Even my father knows this, and I will stand by your side." The two friends renewed their sacred bond before God, and Jonathan departed. Yet others harbored betrayal. Informants from Ziph went straight to Saul, betraying David's hiding place. Saul praised them and urged them to watch his movements closely. Meanwhile, David retreated deep into the wilderness of Maon. Saul pursued, cornering him on a mountain. David's men scrambled on one slope, while the king's army closed the circle on the other. But at the very moment capture seemed inevitable, a breathless messenger reached Saul. "The Philistines have invaded the land once more." Saul abandoned the chase to defend his kingdom. Ever since, that mountain has been called the Rock of Escape. David withdrew, seeking shelter in the high cliffs of En-Gedi. Once the Philistine threat was cleared, Saul was told David had fled to En-Gedi. He handpicked 3,000 elite soldiers and marched into the rugged wilderness to find him. Along the way, Saul stepped inside a dark cave to relieve himself, completely unaware that David and his band were crouching deep in the shadows. David's men whispered eagerly, "This is your moment. The Lord has delivered your enemy right into your hands." David crept forward through the dark. Quietly, his blade severed a corner of Saul's robe. Instantly, his conscience smote him, and he turned back to his men. "May the Lord forbid that I should harm the king," he whispered. "I cannot strike down the one God has anointed." With those words, he restrained his men. Knowing nothing of his narrow escape, Saul rose and left the cave. Moments later, David emerged into the blinding sun, his voice echoing across the rocky valley. My lord the King Saul turned to see David bowing low in reverence. "Why do you listen to those who claim I want to destroy you?" David called out. "Just now the Lord delivered you to me in that cave. My men begged me to end your life, but I spared you. I will not strike God's anointed. Look," my father David held up the severed fabric. "Here is the hem of your robe. I cut it away, yet I left you breathing. This proves I harbor no rebellion or malice. I have not wronged you, though you hunt me down to steal my life. Let the Lord judge between us. May he avenge me if he chooses, but my hand will never touch you. Who has the king of Israel come to hunt? A dead dog? A single flea. May the Lord be our judge, deliver me and vindicate my cause." His words echoed off the canyon walls. Saul's voice broke in response. "Is that your voice, my son David?" And the king wept openly. "You are more righteous than I," Saul cried. "You have returned good for my evil. God delivered me to you, yet you spared my life. Who lets an enemy walk away unharmed? May the Lord bless you for the grace you showed me today. I know now that you will surely rule, and Israel's kingdom will flourish under your hand. Only swear to me by the Lord that you will not destroy my descendants or erase my name." David raised his hand and gave his oath. Saul returned to his palace, while David and his followers retreated to their mountain fortress. During their exile, they had guarded the local shepherds in the wild. At harvest time, David sent a polite request to a wealthy landowner, asking for provisions. But the man, a bitter soul, named Nabal, mocked David and refused. Hearing this, a servant hurried to Abigail, Nabal's wise and gracious wife. He described how David's men had protected them, warning that Nabal's arrogance had doomed them all. Without telling her husband, Abigail quickly gathered bread and wine. What if our deepest rage can only be cured by sudden grace? Carrying roasted grain and fig cakes, Abigail and her servants rode out to intercept David's furious men. Dismounting quickly, Abigail bowed in the dust. She begged David to let the blame fall on her, pleading with him to ignore her husband Nabal, whose very name meant fool. God has stopped you from shedding blood today. Let your enemies end up like Nabal. Take these gifts so when you finally become king, your conscience won't be stained with innocent blood. David's fierce anger melted away. He praised God for sending her and blessed Abigail for her profound wisdom. He took her gifts and turned back, sparing the estate. But when Abigail told her husband what happened, his heart failed. 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Hearing the news, David praised God for executing justice. Soon after, he sent for Abigail, and she became his wife. The men of Ziklag betrayed David, again telling Saul he was hiding on the hill of Helah. Saul took 3,000 elite troops into the wilderness to hunt him down. Learning of Saul's approach, David sent out spies to confirm the threat. That night, he and Abishai slipped silently into the heart of Saul's camp. The king slept soundly among his soldiers, his spear driven into the ground near his head. Abishai whispered, begging David to let him kill Saul with a single blow. But David refused, declaring that no one could strike down the Lord's anointed king and remain innocent in God's eyes. Instead, he grabbed Saul's spear and water jug, and they slipped away unnoticed. A deep sleep from the Lord had fallen over the entire camp. Standing safely on a nearby hill, David shouted down to Abner, the commander, mocking how poorly he had protected his king. He waved the spear and jug, proving the king's life had been at his mercy. Recognizing the voice, Saul cried out, "Is that you, my son David?" David pleaded with him, asking why the king of Israel hunted him down like a flea in the mountains. Deeply shaken, Saul admitted his sin and promised never to harm him again. David replied, "Here is your spear, O king. May the Lord value my life just as I spared yours today." Saul then blessed David, declaring that David would surely triumph and achieve greatness. Saul went home while David returned to the wild, weary of this endless game of cat and mouse. He realized his only safety lay in the land of his enemies, the Philistines. Taking his men and their families, David fled to Gath, ruled by King Achish. His wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, went with him. When word reached Saul that David had escaped to Gath, the relentless pursuit finally ended. David asked Achish for a small country town to live in rather than the royal city. Achish gave him Ziklag, which belonged to the kings of Judah from then on. From there, David led raids against nearby nomadic tribes. They plundered livestock and supplies, leaving no survivors alive to tell the tale. Whenever Achish asked where they had raided, David lied, making it sound like he was attacking his own people in Judah. Because of this deception, Achish trusted David completely, believing his own people now hated him and that David would serve him forever. David stayed there for 16 months. Soon the Philistines gathered their armies at Ak, while the Israelites camped near the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine lords reviewed their troops, David and his men marched in the rear guard. But the military commanders grew suspicious, asking why these Hebrews were there. Achish defended him, saying David had been completely loyal. But the commanders protested, demanding that Achish send him back. They feared he would turn on them in battle, reminding Achish of the song, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." So Achish called David aside. He told him, "You have been as loyal as an angel of God. but the other rulers do not trust you. Leave quietly at dawn." David protested, asking what he had done wrong. Achish replied gently that he was blameless, but insisted he must return for the sake of the Lord's. In his heart, David knew he could never fight against his own flesh and blood. At daybreak, he and his men turned back toward Philistine territory. As the Philistines marched toward Jezreel, David returned to Ziklag 3 days later, only to find the city burned to ashes. Amalekite raiders had pillaged the town, kidnapping their wives and children. The warriors wept until they had no tears left to cry. Even David's wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, were gone. In their bitter grief, the men threatened to stone David, but he found strength in the Lord. He prayed, asking if he should pursue the raiders. God answered, "Pursue them, for you will recover everything." David set out with 600 men. At the Besor ravine, 200 men were too exhausted to cross, so 400 pressed on. Along the way, they found a starving Egyptian slave. After they fed him, the slave agreed to lead them to the Amalekite camp if they spared his life. That night, David launched a surprise attack. They caught the Amalekites feasting and celebrating. The battle raged until the next evening, leaving only 400 survivors who fled on camels. David rescued everyone and everything. Not a single child, wife, or possession was missing, and they reclaimed all their livestock. When they returned, some of the soldiers complained about sharing the spoils with those who stayed behind. But David insisted, "The Lord gave us this victory. Everyone shares equally, both the fighters and those who guarded the baggage." This became a lasting law in Israel. David also sent portions of the plunder as gifts to the elders of Judah, labeling it a gift from the Lord's enemies. Soon after, the Philistines attacked, and the Israelite army fled in panic. Many fell on Mount Gilboa. Saul's sons, Abinadab, Malchishua, and Jonathan, were killed, though the king himself fought bravely. But Philistine archers badly wounded him. Terrified of capture and torture, Saul begged his armor-bearer to end his life. When the man refused, Saul fell on his own sword. Seeing his master dead, the armor-bearer also took his own life. In a single day, the king, his sons, and his army perished, leaving their towns for the Philistines to occupy. The next morning, the Philistines stripped Saul's body, displaying his armor and proclaiming his death throughout their cities. Brave men of Jabesh Gilead rescued the bodies at night, burying them under a tamarisk tree. A quiet reminder that even in our deepest ruins, honor can be restored. Why mourn the tyrant who wanted you dead? After Saul fell. David returned from battle on the third day. A runner stumbled from Saul's camp clothes, torn dust on his head, weeping. He brought dark news. The army had fled, and both Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. The messenger brought the fallen king's crown and armband. Grief struck. David and his men tore their clothes, mourning Saul, Jonathan, and the lost army. Then came the demand for justice. The Amalekite was executed for striking down the Lord's anointed. To honor the fallen, David wrote the Song of the Bow, immortalizing Saul and Jonathan as mighty heroes. Yet his heart broke most for Jonathan, his brother in spirit. He remembered his fierce loyalty, his quiet courage, and how he had shielded David through their darkest hours. With a shattered soul, David wept aloud. How the mighty have fallen, their weapons of war, broken dead upon the silent hills. This was pure, unshielded grief, not just for a lost friend, but for the rare devotion that kept him alive. After years of running, hiding in caves, and dodging death, a quiet relief set in. Saul, his tireless hunter, was finally gone. David paused to lift his spirit to God, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude for guiding him through the dark. I will praise the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. My soul will boast in the Lord. Let the helpless hear and rejoice. Psalm 34. Then he sought God once more. Should I go back to Judah? The divine whisper was clear. Yes, go to Hebron. So David gathered his wives, his warriors, and their families, and settled in the towns around Hebron. Soon the leaders of Judah arrived and anointed David as king, lifting a heavy weight from his shoulders. But true leadership remembers. Honoring those who stayed loyal to Saul, even in death, David sent a message of deep gratitude to Jabesh-Gilead. He blessed them for giving Saul a dignified burial and staying true. Then he turned his voice to the rest of Judah. Taking the mantle, he urged them to stand united, ready for what lay ahead. But Saul's bloodline wasn't entirely erased. One son survived Ishbosheth. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, took him to Mahanaim and crowned him king of Israel. Meanwhile, David ruled Hebron, backed by the unwavering loyalty of Judah. Tensions boiled over when Abner marched Ishbosheth's troops from Mahanaim to Gibeon. To meet them, Joab led David's seasoned warriors into the field. The two armies stared each other down across the pool of Gibeon weapons drawn. To test their resolve, Abner proposed a lethal trial. 12 champions from each side would fight to the death. Joab agreed. With eyes locked in hatred, the 24 men clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. All 24 fell together. That bloody soil would forever be called the Field of Swords. But this was only the beginning. A savage battle erupted, and David's men utterly shattered Abner's forces. Standing in the thick of the chaos were 3 legendary brothers, the sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Young Asahel, fast and relentless as a wild gazelle, locked his eyes on Abner. Abner looked back and begged him to turn away, desperate to avoid a blood feud with his brother Joab. But Asahel refused to stop. Left with no choice, Abner drove the blunt end of his spear clean through the boy's body. Asahel collapsed, dead. At that sight, both armies froze in horror. Blinded by rage, Joab and Abishai hunted Abner down. They cornered him just as the sun dipped below the hill of Ammah near the dusty road to Gibeon. Abner's men rallied on the hilltop, bracing for a final stand. Abner shouted down, pleading to end the useless slaughter, warning him that sibling blood only breeds endless bitterness. Joab relented, knowing that without that plea, the hunt would have raged all night. Joab sounded the ram's horn, calling off the pursuit. Abner's defeated army marched through the dark Jordan Valley, crossing the river and reaching Mahanaim by dawn. Joab marched his men home to count their dead. 19 brave warriors lay cold beside young Asahel. On the other side, 360 of Abner's men lay dead. David's warriors carried Asahel's body back to Bethlehem, burying him in his father's tomb. They marched all night, reaching Hebron as dawn broke. It was the spark of a long, brutal civil war between Saul's loyalists and David's rising kingdom. As seasons passed, David grew steadily stronger, while the house of Saul slowly withered away. Throughout the bitter struggle, Abner consolidated his power and influence. But a sharp accusation from Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, drove him to fury. The prince accused him of sleeping with the late king's concubine, a treasonous play for the throne. Enraged, Abner made a fateful decision. He would back David and unite the fractured tribes. Abner sent a message promising to deliver the entire nation. David agreed, demanding only the return of his first wife, Michal. She was torn from her weeping husband, Palti, who followed her until Abner ordered him back. Abner rallied the elders of Israel, reminding them they had long wanted David as king. He urged them to make their move now. The leaders agreed, and the pieces fell into place. Abner journeyed to Hebron to seal the pact. David welcomed the general with a lavish feast honoring his new ally. With Abner paving the road, the long-divided tribes were finally ready to unite, ushering in a new era of peace. But just after David sent Abner away under a flag of truce, Joab returned from a victorious raid, his men laden with spoil. Hearing that Abner had met with the king and departed in peace, a dangerous fury ignited. Convinced the general was merely a spy, Joab secretly dispatched messengers to hunt Abner down and lure him back to Hebron under false pretenses. Meeting Abner at the city gate, Joab pulled him into a quiet corner as if to whisper a secret and plunged a blade into his chest. The murder was cold-blooded revenge for Asahel. When David heard of the betrayal, he was shattered, swearing that his throne bore no guilt for Abner's blood. He placed the guilt on Joab's house, ordering his court to wear sackcloth. Even in triumph, we are haunted by our shadow. Why do we mourn the very rivals we once feared? David walked behind Abner's casket, leading a nation drowned in tears. Beside the grave, David sang his lament, should Abner have died like a fool. Your hands were not bound, your feet not chained. You fell betrayed by wicked hands. The king fasted all day, refusing food, until the sun went down. Seeing this grief, the people knew he had no hand in the murder. A great leader had fallen. David trusted God to repay the wicked Joab and Abishai men, far too powerful for him to control. The nation grieved. Justice belonged to God, and they laid Abner to rest with honor. But when Saul's son Ishboz heard of the tragedy at Hebron, his courage completely failed. Fear swept through the land, paralyzing the people. Amidst this chaos, two treacherous brothers, Baana and Rahab, led Ishbosheth's elite raiding parties. They came from Beero in the land of Benjamin. On a scorching afternoon, they slipped into Ishbosheth's house while he rested, and his guard, exhausted from sifting wheat, had drifted off to sleep. The brothers crept inside, found the prince asleep in his bed, struck him down, and severed his head. They fled through the dark Jordan Valley, carrying the severed head. Arriving at Hebron, they presented it to David, claiming they had avenged him and punished Saul's bloodline. David was filled with horror. Swearing by the living God, he refused to reward such cowardice, especially the slaughter of an innocent man sleeping in his own bed. The king ordered swift justice. Barner and Rechab were executed, their hands and feet severed as a warning to all. Their bodies hung by the pool of Hebron. But Ishbosheth's head was buried with respect in Abner's tomb. Soon all the tribes of Israel gathered before David. They spoke of his past victories, of how he led them even when Saul wore the crown. They remembered the divine promise David would shepherd Israel. At Hebron, David made a sacred covenant with the elders before God, a symbolic alignment of a divided nation under one true king. David was 30 years old when he took the throne, reigning for 40 years. He led his forces to Jerusalem to battle the Jebusites, the ancient keepers of the land. The defenders mocked him, feeling safe behind their walls. Yet years earlier, David had brought Goliath's severed head to this very city, proving God stood with him. Now he had returned to conquer it. David breached the fortress of Zion, and that mighty stronghold became known as the City of David. He made it his home and built up the city, starting at the massive terraces and working inward. David grew stronger because the Lord of hosts was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent cedar timber carpenters and stonemasons to build him a palace. The king knew God had established his kingdom for the sake of Israel. In Jerusalem, he took more wives and concubines, fathering more sons and daughters. When the Philistines heard of David's coronation, they mobilized their armies to hunt him down. Warned of the threat, David retreated to his fortress. The enemy flooded the valley of Rephaim. David sought divine guidance, and God promised him victory. He struck them at Baal-perazim, crushing their forces. The Lord broke through my enemies like a raging flood, the king declared. So they named that place Baal-perazim, which means the Lord who bursts through. When the Philistines returned to swarm the valley once more, David again asked God what to do. This time God told him to circle around near the poplar trees. When David heard the sound of marching in the treetops, He knew God was leading the charge. He obeyed, driving the Philistines back all the way from Gibeon to Gaza. This victory came not by human strength, but through total surrender to the divine plan. David gathered 30,000 of Israel's finest warriors. He led them to Judah to bring back the sacred ark of God, which rode upon a brand new cart. Uzzah and Io guided the cart. David and the crowds followed, dancing and playing lyres, harps, tambourines, and cymbals. Pure joy filled the air. Then sudden tragedy. At the threshing floor, the oxen stumbled. Uzzah reached out to steady the sacred chest, and God's anger flared. He fell dead right beside it. Shock and terror gripped the crowd. David named the place Perezah. Terrified of God's power, he paused the journey, leaving the ark at Edom's house for 3 months. When David heard how God blessed Obed-Edom's household because of the ark, he took heart. With renewed joy, he went to bring the sacred chest into his city. They sacrificed bulls and calves. David danced with all his might, wearing a simple priestly vest, as Israel shouted and blew ram's horns. The ark was home at last, and the city erupted in celebration. But watching from a high window, Saul's daughter Michal looked down in silence. She saw her king leaping and dancing before God, and her heart filled with disgust. He had stripped off his royal robes to dance without restraint. Without his crown, he was just a man. Strip away our titles and achievements, who are we really? David knew his true identity lay in God. They set the ark inside the special tent David had pitched. The king offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, then blessed the entire crowd in the name of the Lord of hosts. He distributed a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a raisin cake to every single man and woman. With full hearts, the people returned home. When David returned to bless his household, Michal met him with a sneer. She immediately mocked him, whispering biting insults about how he had exposed himself before the servant girls. David replied, "I was dancing before the Lord who chose me over your father and your entire family. I will happily humiliate myself further to honor him. My joy is in God, not the praise of men." Because of her bitter contempt, Michal remained childless for the rest of her life. With his palace built, the king finally found peace as God secured his borders from every enemy. But looking around his luxury, a sudden realization hit him. While he slept in a magnificent palace of cedar, the ark of God remained in a fragile tent. Determined to build a temple, David summoned the prophet Nathan. But that very night, God spoke to the prophet. God reminded him that he had never requested a permanent house. Ever since leading Israel out of Egypt, God had lived in tents, wandering alongside his people. He had taken David from the sheep pastures to make him a ruler, protecting him in battle and crushing his enemies. Now God promised to make his name legendary. Israel would find a safe home. This promise of an eternal dynasty and a temple built for God remains a blueprint for our own restless souls. An eternal kingdom secured forever. God would guide him like a devoted father, and his grace would never be withdrawn. This was the promise the prophet Nathan brought to King David. David sat in the quiet presence of the Lord, whispering, "Who am I, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? You promise us an eternal dynasty. May the house of David stand before you forever. Let your sacred blessing rest upon us, O Lord. This blessing is eternal." Soon after David conquered the Philistines, taking their city G, the land of Moab also surrendered, paying him tribute. Next, he struck Hadadezer, king of Zobah, crushing his vast army. He captured thousands of infantry and hundreds of chariots. When the Arameans rode to help David, broke them too, demanding tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he marched. He carried gold, bronze, and plunder back to Jerusalem, dedicating it all. Even King Toi of Hamath sent him tribute. David struck down 18,000 men and stationed garrisons throughout Edom. All became his servants. the Lord made David victorious wherever he went. He ruled Israel with justice and wisdom. Joab commanded the army, while Jehoshaphat kept the records. Zadok and Ahimhim served as priests, and Benaiah led the royal bodyguard. Secure on his throne, the king asked a single question. Was anyone left of the royal house of Saul? He wanted to show them kindness for Jonathan's sake. He summoned Ziba, an old servant of Saul. Ziba revealed that one of Jonathan's sons still lived. His name was Mephibosheth, crippled in both feet, hiding away in Lobar, in Machia's house. David sent for him. When Mephibosheth arrived, he bowed low in fear. David welcomed him, promising deep mercy for his father Jonathan's sake. He restored all of Saul's lands to him. From that day on, Mephibosheth would dine at the king's table, treated like royalty. The young man was completely stunned. He bowed, calling himself as worthless as a dead dog. But David turned to Ziba, declaring that all the land belonged to Mephibosheth, to be farmed by Ziba, his 15 sons, and 20 servants. Mephibosheth himself would eat at the royal table. Ziba agreed, and from then on, Mephibosheth ate with the king like family. He also had a young son named Micah. Ziba's entire household now worked for him. Though crippled in both feet, Mephibosheth lived in the capital, dining daily at the king's own table. When King Nahash of the Ammonites died, his son Hanun took the throne. David sent messengers to offer condolences, but Hanun's paranoid commanders called them spies. He decided to humiliate them. He shaved off half their beards, cut their robes short, and sent them away in disgrace. David told the humiliated men to stay in Jericho until their beards regrew. Realizing their mistake, the Ammonites hired 20,000 Aramean mercenaries, along with other allies. David dispatched Joab. Joab struck the Arameans while his brother Abishai targeted the Ammonites. The Arameans broke and fled, and the Ammonites retreated behind their walls. When the Arameans regrouped under Shobach, David rallied all Israel, crushing their forces and killing Shobach himself. The defeated kings surrendered, and the Arameans never dared to aid Ammon again. Then came the spring, the season when kings traditionally marched to war. David sent Joab and the entire army of Israel to crush the Ammonites besieging their capital, Rabbah. But this time David chose to stay behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after rising from his bed, David walked along his palace roof. Looking down, he saw a woman bathing, strikingly beautiful. In the past, David had resisted temptation. From the dangerous halls of Saul to the spoils of war, he had always walked with integrity when no one was watching. But now, at the absolute peak of his power, a dark shift occurred deep within his heart. A quiet malice began to rise, and in that moment he forgot the king who truly reigns. He inquired about her identity and discovered her name, Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Ignoring the warning, David sent messengers to seize her and bring her to him. He slept with her that night, and she returned home. Soon Bathsheba sent a devastating message. She was pregnant. Panicked, David summoned Uriah from the front, asking how the battle fared. David urged Uriah to go home and wash his feet and rest, even sending a royal gift after him. But Uriah refused. He slept outside the palace gates with the royal guard. When David demanded to know why, Uriah replied, "The army is out in the open field. How could I go home to eat, drink, and sleep with my wife?" David was stung by Uriah's incredible loyalty, seeing a soldier's pure honor and devotion to his brothers in arms. Yet David kept him there for one more day. The next night David fed him and got him drunk, hoping to break his resolve. Still, Uriah refused to go home, sleeping outside with his comrades. David's desperate scheme had completely failed. Pure panic set in. Soon Uriah and the entire kingdom would realize the child was not his, and the whispers would trace back directly to the king. Fractures were splitting his once perfect legacy. But deep within his heart, had already turned cold, calloused, and unyielding. At dawn, David penned a secret letter to Joab, hand-delivering it to Uriah himself. The letter ordered Joab to station Uriah at the very front lines where the fighting was deadliest. He ordered the troops to retreat, leaving Uriah to be cut down. David's conscience was so corrupted that he made this loyal soldier carry his own execution order. Joab obeyed without question, positioning Uriah near the city wall where the defense was strongest. When the enemy surged out to clash with Israel's forces, Uriah was slaughtered alongside several other brave soldiers. Joab quickly dispatched a messenger to carry the dark news of the battle back to David. He told the runner that if the king grew angry about fighting so close to the walls, he should deliver the final blow. Uriah the Hittite was also dead. David received the news coldly, telling the messenger to reassure Joab. The sword devours one today and another tomorrow. Press the attack and destroy the city. Hearing of her husband's death, Uriah's wife wept and mourned for him. Once her days of grief ended, David sent for her, bringing her into his palace. She became his wife and bore him a son. Yet in the quiet spaces of his soul, David knew Uriah's integrity had far outshone his own darkest desires. But the Lord saw what David had done and was deeply displeased. He sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king with a simple story of two men in a town, one wealthy, one poor. The rich man possessed vast herds of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, raising it like his own child. It shared his food and drank from his cup. He loved it like a daughter. One day a traveler arrived at the rich man's estate. Unwilling to slaughter his own livestock, the wealthy man stole the poor man's beloved lamb. He slaughtered it to feed his guest. David burned with sudden righteous anger, shouting, "As the Lord lives, that man deserves to die. He must pay fourfold for what he did." Then Nathan looked directly at the king and whispered, "You are that man." The Lord, the God of Israel, then reminded David of every blessing he had poured out upon him, making him king. He was rescued from Saul, given his palace, his family, and promised far more. Yet David threw it away. He despised the divine word and committed an unforgivable act. He had slaughtered Uriah the Hittite and stolen his wife. Now the prophet Nathan delivered the curse. Violence would never leave David's own house. Rebellion would rise from within his own family. His wives would be taken by a rival right before the nation. What David hid in darkness, God would drag into the light. Shattered David wept before the prophet, confessing his great sin against God. Nathan replied with a heavy truth. The Lord had indeed forgiven him. You will not lose your life for this crime. But because of your actions, your newborn child must die. Then Nathan departed. Soon after, a terrible sickness struck the infant. David pleaded for mercy, starving himself, lying face down on the cold dirt all night, weeping in agony. His elders begged him to eat, but he refused. On the seventh day, the child drew his last breath. Terrified of his grief, the servants whispered, dreading his reaction. Seeing them whisper, David asked if the boy was gone. They nodded. Slowly David stood, washed the dust from his skin, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He walked to the tabernacle to worship the Creator. Returning to his palace, he finally sat down and ate, leaving his servants utterly bewildered. They questioned him, asking why he fasted and wept while the boy fought for life, but now, with the child dead, he feasted. David answered them, "While the child breathed, I starved myself and wept, hoping God might show mercy. But now, he is gone. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back? One day I will go to him, but he can never return to me." David accepted the divine verdict, a crushing, brutal price to pay for the devastating sin he committed. In his brokenness, David cried out, begging God for mercy through his unfailing love. He prayed to be washed clean, to have his guilt fully stripped away. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a loyal spirit. In Psalm 51, we witness a man finally confronting the true gravity of his actions. He realized that God never rejects a broken and repentant soul. Here in his deepest failure, he discovered that divine mercy always triumphs over judgment. David comforted Bathsheba in her grief. Soon she bore him another son, whom they named Solomon, a child destined for greatness. God loved the boy. Nathan named him Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. Meanwhile, David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar. Her beauty was striking. Her half-brother Amnon grew so intensely obsessed with her that he physically fell ill. Watching this was his highly cunning cousin Jonadab. Jonadab asked why the king's son looked so exhausted each morning. Amnon confessed his dark desire, and his cousin offered a twisted scheme. He urged him to pretend to be ill. When David visited, he should beg for Tamar to cook and feed him personally. Amnon agreed. Unaware of the trap, David sent Tamar to prepare the meal. She baked the bread and brought it to him, but Amnon refused to eat. He ordered his servants out, demanding Tamar bring the food into his private chamber. As she offered it, Amnon seized her, ignoring her desperate cries to stop. She pleaded with him to stop saying such evil had no place in Israel, urging him to ask the king for marriage. But he overpowered her. He defiled her, and instantly his lust turned to bitter hatred. He cast her out, locking the door. Torn and broken, she put ashes on her head and wept. Her brother Absalom found her in ruins and demanded to know what happened. Once she spoke, he told her to stay silent for now. He told her not to despair, since Amnon was family. Tamar remained a broken, isolated woman in Absalom's home, while Absalom quietly harbored a murderous hatred for Amnon. King David raged upon hearing the news, yet he took no action. A tragic failure of leadership, the legendary champion of justice chose absolute silence. Evil had infected his palace. Bloodshed, betrayal, and violation were out in the open. David's quietness was deafening, and the foundations of Israel began to fracture. True justice was abandoned, leaving deep wounds festering. The division in David's family widened, setting the stage for a massive tragedy. Absalom plotted his violent rebellion, forcing David back into hiding. 2 years passed in silence before Absalom hosted a shearing festival in Baal Hazor, near Ephraim. Absalom invited all the royal brothers to a feast, then approached King David, pleading with him to join the celebration in the countryside. David politely declined, wishing not to burden his son with his royal entourage. Despite Absalom's persistent pleading, the king stayed behind, offering only his blessing. Absalom then pushed further, requesting his brother Amnon attend. David hesitated, but the boy insisted. Reluctantly, the king agreed to send all his sons, including Amnon. At the feast, Absalom ordered his men to strike Amnon down once the wine took hold. Under Absalom's direct orders, they executed Amnon. The remaining princes fled in terror on their mules, while frantic rumors raced back to David in Jerusalem. The terrible message claimed Absalom had slaughtered all his brothers. Stricken with grief, David tore his clothes and collapsed as his court wept in absolute horror. But Jonadab, David's clever nephew, intervened. He urged the king not to despair, explaining that only Amnon was targeted and killed. This revenge was planned the moment Amnon violated Tamar. As Absalom fled into exile, a palace watchman spotted a massive crowd descending the hillside. He rushed to alert the king as Jonadab pointed toward the horizon. The remaining princes arrived weeping bitterly, and the entire court joined in their profound sorrow. David spent long, agonizing days mourning his lost son. Meanwhile, Absalom found refuge with his grandfather, the king of Geshur, remaining there for 3 years. Once the sting of death faded, David deep down yearned for his exiled son. Sensing this, the general Joab summoned a highly perceptive woman from Tekoa. Renowned for her sharp intellect, she was instructed to play the role of a grieving widow dressing in dark robes to evoke deep sympathy. Her task was to present an undeniable parable. Bowing low before David, she pleaded for justice, spinning a tale of a poor widow whose two sons turned on each other. One brother lay dead, and now the clan demanded the execution of the survivor, threatening to wipe her late husband's legacy from the earth forever. Moved, the king vowed to protect her remaining child. Seizing the moment, the clever woman urged him to apply that same mercy to his own broken family. What happens when our quest for justice is secretly manipulated? She spoke of mercy, but confessed Joab sent her. Joab admitted he wanted this truth reframed so the king could finally act. David agreed, and Joab brought Absalom back to Jerusalem from exile. Yet the king refused to see him. Confined to his house, Absalom remained unseen and grew into the most beautiful yet tragic figure in all Israel. From head to toe, he was flawless. His heavy hair grew so long he cut it only once a year, weighing a massive 5 pounds. He fathered 3 sons and a beautiful daughter, Tamar. Yet for 2 years in Jerusalem, he lived in the shadow of the king's silence. He begged Joab to intercede, but his pleas were twice ignored. Deeply frustrated by this silence, Absalom ordered his servants to set fire to Joab's adjacent barley field. The servants obeyed. When Joab demanded an explanation, Absalom asked, "Why was I brought back from Geshur if I am still forbidden from seeing the king's face?" He was ready to face the king, even if it meant death. Joab delivered the message, and finally David summoned his exiled son. Absalom bowed low, and the king kissed him. Soon after, Absalom bought a chariot horses and hired 50 men to run before him. Each morning he stood at the city gate, intercepting those seeking the king's justice. He validated their struggles, declaring how he wished he could judge them fairly. People brought their disputes, and he treated them with deep warmth, embracing them and refusing to let anyone bow before his presence. Through this calculated warmth, Absalom stole the hearts of Israel. After 4 years, he asked the king to let him go to Hebron to fulfill a sacred vow. David allowed him to go, unaware that in Hebron, Absalom was secretly plotting a massive rebellion. He ordered them to proclaim him king at the sound of the ram's horn. 200 innocent men followed him blindly. During the sacrifices, he summoned Ahithophel. He was David's trusted counselor, and soon many others joined. The conspiracy grew strong. Suddenly, a messenger brought devastating news to Jerusalem. All Israel had joined Absalom's conspiracy. David knew they had to flee immediately to save the city from destruction, and his advisors agreed. The king and his household fled on foot, leaving only 10 concubines to guard the empty palace. 600 loyal soldiers from Gath and his personal bodyguards led the retreat. David urged Ittai, the leader of the Gittites, to return. He was an exile, a foreigner, and should not suffer the king's harsh banishment. But Ittai swore to follow the king to the very end, even unto death. Moved by his loyalty, David allowed him and his men to stay. The people wept aloud as they crossed the Kidron Valley, heading into the wilderness. Zadok and the Levites carried the sacred Ark of the Covenant. Abiathar offered sacrifices until the city emptied. David told Zadok to return the ark. If God willed, David would see it and its sanctuary again. He also sent the priests and their sons back to watch. David climbed the Mount of Olives, weeping, his head covered and his feet bare. His followers wept with him. When David heard that Ahithophel, his trusted advisor, had joined the coup, he prayed God would turn his counsel into foolishness. At the summit, Hushai the Archite met David in deep grief, his clothes torn and dirt on his head. David urged him to return to Jerusalem. Hushai was to pretend to advise Absalom, working to frustrate Ahithophel's plans. Meanwhile, the priests would smuggle him news from the palace. Hushai returned just as Absalom entered the city. Meanwhile, past the summit of the Mount of Olives, David met Ziba. He was Mephibosheth's servant, leading 2 donkeys carrying 200 loaves of bread, 100 raisin cakes, summer fruits, and a wineskin of wine. The food and wine were meant to sustain the exhausted in the harsh wilderness, while the donkeys were for the royal family to ride. David asked about Saul's grandson. Ziba claimed he stayed behind, hoping the people of Israel would restore his grandfather's lost kingdom. David immediately gave Mephibosheth's lands to Ziba. Bowing, Ziba pledged his loyalty. Just as David reached Bahurim, a bitter enemy appeared. A man from Saul's family, Shimei, emerged from the village, screaming curses and hurling heavy stones at David and his men. He shouted that David was paying for Saul's blood and that God had given the kingdom to Absalom. Abishai wanted to kill him, but David stopped him. He reasoned that if the Lord had commanded Shimei to curse him, no one should interfere. After all, his own son was hunting his life. A Benjamite had even more reason to hate him. David chose to endure the shame, hoping God would see his suffering and bless him. Shimei tracked them along the ridge, throwing stones and cursing. Exhausted, the king and his weary followers finally rested by the Jordan River. Absalom and his rebel army marched into Jerusalem, accompanied by Ahithophel. Hushai, David's loyal friend, also arrived and went straight to the usurper. He greeted him with deep respect. When Absalom questioned his loyalty to David, Hushai replied that he must serve the one chosen by Israel. He vowed to serve Absalom just as he had his father. Seeking to secure his grip, Absalom turned to Ahithophel, who advised him to sleep with his father's concubines. He argued this public act would make the breach with his father absolute. Absalom complied, pitching a tent on the palace roof for all to see. There he violated his father's concubines. In those days, Ahithophel's advice was treated like the word of God, and Absalom followed it blindly. Ahithophel then proposed a lethal strike: lead 12,000 men tonight to hunt down David while he is weary, discouraged, and weak. The royal forces would scatter in panic, leaving only David to be killed. Then the entire nation would return to Absalom in peace. The elders loved this advice, but Absalom summoned Hushai the Archite for his opinion. Hushai warned that David and his veterans were dangerous cornered beasts. They were fierce, experienced, and prepared. A rushed attack could easily fail and cause a devastating panic among Absalom's rebel army. Hushai urged gathering all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, advising Absalom to lead them. A timeless mirror of how our own pride can completely overwhelm us. What if the deepest betrayal of your life came from your own blood? Fleeing into the shadows, David knew a walled city would become his tomb if his enemies closed in. A fatal misstep for the rebel prince. Hushai secretly warned the high priests, exposing the deadly trap and revealing his own hidden plan. He urged them to send a desperate message to the king. Do not camp by the riverbanks tonight. Escape into the wilderness or die. 2 messengers hid by the spring waiting for the signal. But a young boy spotted them and snitched. They fled to a nearby village, slipping down into a dark well. A woman quickly draped a cloth over the opening and scattered grain to hide it. The hunters searched the house, finding absolutely nothing. The spies slipped out of the well and reached the king with the warning. Under the cover of dark skies, David and his people crossed the river safely. Realizing his counsel was rejected, the ruined advisor went home, set his affairs in order, and hanged himself. Meanwhile, David reached Mahanaim as the rebel army gathered. The rebel forces camped in Gilead, while weary allies emerged from the dust to welcome the broken king. They brought food, bedding, and essential provisions for the refugees, knowing they were completely exhausted from their long trek through the barren wasteland. David rallied his remaining men and appointed captains over them. He split his forces into 3 divisions, putting the first under the fierce Joab. The second went to Abishai, and the third to Ittai. David declared he would march to war with them, but his battle-hardened troops flatly refused. They warned him that the enemy wanted only his life, which was worth 10,000 of theirs. The king relented, standing by the gate as his army marched out. He pleaded with his commanders to spare his rebellious son. "Deal gently with the boy," he begged. Then the bloody clash began in the dense forest. David's veteran soldiers crushed the rebel lines, killing 20,000 men. But the ancient tangled forest claimed more lives than the sword itself. During the chaos, the rebel Prince Absalom fled on his mule. His long hair caught in the thick branches of an oak, leaving him hanging in midair. A soldier spotted him but refused to strike, remembering the king's order. But Joab had no mercy. He drove 3 daggers into the prince's heart, while 10 soldiers finished him. Joab blew the ram's horn, halting the pursuit. They dragged the prince's body into a deep pit and piled a massive mound of stones over him. The rebel army scattered. Years before, the childless prince had built a grand monument in the king's valley to preserve his legacy. It still stands empty and hollow. A young priest wanted to run to David with news of the victory. But Joab stopped him, saying, "It was no day for good news, since the prince was dead." Instead, Joab sent a runner from Ethiopia to deliver the report. But the priest begged so hard that the commander finally let him run as well. The young priest took the flat route across the plains, running ahead of the foreigner. Meanwhile, David sat anxiously between the town's double gates. The lookout on the roof spotted a lone runner and shouted down to the king. When a second appeared, David hoped for victory. The young priest arrived first. He fell to his knees, shouting that the rebellion was crushed. But when David asked about his boy, the messenger hesitated, claiming ignorance. Then the second runner arrived, announcing deliverance. But when the anxious father asked about his son, the messenger replied coldly, wishing the prince's fatal end on all the king's enemies. The king collapsed. Limping up to the chamber over the gate, he wailed in absolute agony, crying, "Oh, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you!" Word quickly reached Joab that the king was weeping for his betrayer. The heavy shadow of David's grief cast a dark cloud over his victorious army. The joy of survival instantly turned to bitter mourning. The soldiers sneaked back into the city in silence, looking like defeated men who had deserted the field. The king covered his face, weeping without end. Furious at this betrayal of loyalty, Joab confronted him, reminding him that these soldiers had just saved his life. He warned the king to honor his troops or face an even worse rebellion. Reluctantly, David went out and took his place at the city gate. As the news traveled, the people gathered around him. Meanwhile, the defeated rebels who had backed the dead prince quietly slipped away to their homes. Throughout the land, a quiet realization dawned. The people remembered how David had once saved them from their enemies, while the dead rebel had only brought ruin. Now they wanted their king back. David sent word to the priests, asking the elders of his own tribe of Judah why they were the last to welcome him. He even offered the rebel general Amasa Joab's command. Won over by this stunning act of mercy, the leaders of Judah united to support the king. With one voice, they invited the exiled king and his loyal followers to return. And so David began his long journey back to his throne. When he reached the Jordan, a vast crowd met him at Gilgal, eagerly escorting the royal household back across the waters that had once divided them. Shimei, the man who had cursed David during his darkest hour, rushed down with 1,000 supporters. Falling to his knees, he begged for mercy and forgiveness. David spared his life, choosing grace over vengeance. Then Saul's crippled grandson, Mephibosheth, came to welcome the king. He had lived in deep neglect since the day the king fled. He explained how his servant had deceived him, yet remained grateful for David's favor. Though David offered to split the land, the loyal heir replied that the king's safe return was all the treasure he needed. Aged Barzillai, the wealthy ally who had supported David in exile, came to escort him. The king invited him to Jerusalem, but the old man declined. He sent his son, Chimham, in his place. With a parting blessing, the king crossed the river and headed toward the home he had nearly lost. Yet even in victory, unity fractured. A bitter argument flared as the other tribes accused Judah of stealing the honor of bringing the king home. Judah snapped back, claiming the king as their close relative. The ancient tribal rivalry burned hot as the royal procession moved onward. War flared again with the Philistines, and an aging David grew faint in the heat of battle. A giant carrying a heavy bronze spear cornered the exhausted king. As the giant raised his blade, Abishai charged in, slaying the monster, reminding us that even kings cannot fight their giants alone. Why must we face the giants of our own minds? David's men begged him to withdraw from the front lines, fearing his light would go out as Sibbecai battled the giant Saph. Then Elhanan of Bethlehem slew the brother of Goliath, a monster whose spear resembled a weaver's beam. And in Gath they faced a towering man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. This beast taunted Israel, but Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimea, cut him down. Thus these 4 monstrous giants of Gath fell before David and his elite warriors. In the quiet after battle, David sang praises to the God who delivered him from every enemy. My God is my fortress, my rock, the one in whom I take refuge. He is my shield, the horn of my salvation, and my high stronghold, my sanctuary and my Savior, protecting me from the violence of this world. I cried out to the Lord, who is worthy of all praise, and he rescued me from my foes. These words from 2 Samuel are the final testament of David, Israel's sweet psalmist. The Spirit of God spoke through him. He declared that those who rule justly, walking in fear of God, are like the brilliant morning sun breaking through a cloudless sky. An everlasting covenant promised to David's house. But the godless are like thorns discarded and dangerous. They must be consumed with fire. David's final warning echoes down the ages. Walk with the divine and find life, or turn away and crumble. These are the legends of David's elite guard. First was Jashobeam, the Hakmonite, who single-handedly slaughtered 800 enemy soldiers in a single desperate stand. Then came Eleazar, son of Dodo. When the rest of the army retreated in panic, he stood beside David, striking down the enemy until his hand grew weary and froze to his sword. That day the Lord brought about an incredible victory. After him was Shammah, son of Agi, who faced a raiding party in a field full of lentils. While others fled, Shammah took his stand. He defended the field fiercely, and God delivered a massive victory. Later, during harvest, David hid in the cave of Adullam. The enemy army lay camped in the valley of Rephaim, occupying Bethlehem. Deep in his exile, David whispered a quiet longing for a drink from the well near Bethlehem's gate. Hearing this, the 3 champions broke through the enemy lines. They drew the water and brought it back, but David refused to drink a single drop. Instead, he poured it out onto the dry earth as an offering to the Lord. How could he drink the very blood of men who had risked their lives for his comfort? Such was the fierce loyalty of his mighty men. But as King David grew frail with age, his ambitious son Adonijah plotted to seize the crown, gathering chariots, horsemen, and powerful allies. He proclaimed himself king, deliberately excluding Solomon, the rightful heir, and David's loyal inner circle. Sensing the danger, Nathan the prophet and Solomon's mother Bathsheba moved swiftly. They approached the dying king, reminding him of his solemn oath. That very hour, David ordered Solomon to be anointed king at the Gihon spring. The crowd erupted, shouting, "Long live King Solomon," until the earth shook with joy. Hearing the noise, the conspirators panicked, and Adonijah fled to the altar, begging for mercy. Solomon spared his brother on the condition of loyalty. David saw his promise fulfilled and praised God as Solomon began his peaceful reign. As David felt his own death approaching, he called Solomon to his bedside for one final charge. He urged the young king to be strong, showing himself a man. He charged him to walk in the ways of the Lord. By obeying the royal covenant would stand. Then the old king shared some cold, pragmatic advice on who to reward and who to eliminate. Joab, who had murdered innocent commanders, needed to face justice. Meanwhile, the sons of Barzillai, who supported David in his darkest hours, were to be honored. And Shimei, who had cursed the king in his flight, must finally answer for his treason. With these final commands, David drew his last breath and was buried in Jerusalem. Solomon took the throne, securing his grip on the kingdom. God's ancient plan moved forward, for David's story was never meant to end in a tomb. God had made a promise. When your life is complete and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up an heir from your body and establish his kingdom forever. I will be his father and he shall be my son. Your house and your dynasty will stand secure before me. Your throne will be established forever, says 2 Samuel. Centuries passed. Kings rose and fell, and the kingdom split, eventually falling to conquest. Yet the promise remained. In the darkness of Bethlehem, simple shepherds keeping watch saw the heavens open with a message of hope. The ancient covenant was finally met. Out of David's bloodline came the Messiah, the true king. At first, much like his ancestor, he seemed insignificant to the world. But his life would rewrite human history. Just as promised, his spiritual kingdom reigns eternal. David's journey reveals the profound reality of what happens when a soul trusts completely in the divine. This is the path from obscure beginnings to an eternal legacy. When your story is written, will it reflect a faith that held fast during your darkest hours? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. May the peace and blessing of the Lord rest upon you and your household. Amen.